The city of New Orleans, jewel of the Mississippi, glimmered with wealth, trade, and music drifting from taverns at night. But beneath the Spanish colonial banners and the bustling markets, whispers ran like fire through the enslaved population. The French Revolution had toppled kings. Haiti, only across the water, was already aflame with the most powerful slave rebellion the world had ever seen. And in Louisiana, enslaved men and women dreamed of something just as daring: to rise up, seize the port of New Orleans, and turn the city of merchants and soldiers into a city of freedom. It began in the shadows, conversations behind kitchen doors, coded messages exchanged at the docks, leaders who moved silently between plantations and town squares. The plan was immense. Thousands of enslaved Africans would strike at once, torching the city, cutting down their masters, and claiming the Mississippi for themselves. But revolutions rarely move unseen. Betrayal crept in. Spanish officials, already paranoid about another Haiti, captured ringleaders, tortured confessions, and executed dozens. The revolt never reached its full spark, but the terror it provoked lingered. For Louisiana's rulers, the conspiracy confirmed their greatest fear: that slavery's foundations could collapse in a single night. This is the story of the Louisiana Conspiracy of 1795. A story of courage and calculation, of betrayal and brutality, of how the dream of freedom stalked the streets of New Orleans long before emancipation. It is also a story of global echoes, where revolutions in France and Haiti shaped resistance on the Mississippi, and where whispers in the dark shook an empire. The 1790s were a decade of revolutions. Across the Atlantic, monarchies tottered, cities erupted, and empires bled. In Paris, the French Revolution had cut down a king, declaring liberty and equality for all men, though the revolution's promises rarely extended to the colonies. In the Caribbean, the enslaved of Saint-Domingue, the richest sugar colony in the world, were rising in a struggle that would birth Haiti, the first Black Republic. And along the banks of the Mississippi, in a territory ruled uneasily by Spain, a city simmered with whispers of rebellion: New Orleans. At first glance, Louisiana in 1795 seemed secure. Spain had taken the territory from France in 1763 after the 7 Years' War. The Spanish crown saw it as a buffer zone, protection for Mexico's silver mines, and a gateway to the vast trade networks of the Gulf. New Orleans itself, perched on a crescent of the Mississippi, was a bustling port town of perhaps 8,000 people. A mosaic of languages and cultures: Spanish officials, French merchants, German farmers from upriver, free people of color, native traders, and thousands of enslaved Africans. But beneath its lively markets and grand colonial houses, Louisiana was fragile. Its very wealth depended on the backs of the enslaved. By the 1790s, enslaved Africans made up more than half the population of the colony. They cut cane in the fields, tended indigo vats, hauled goods along the levees, and labored in kitchens and workshops. In New Orleans, slavery was visible in every street. A visitor could not buy bread, load a boat, or walk past the governor's palace without seeing enslaved men and women carrying burdens, selling wares, or standing silently behind their masters. Yet the enslaved were not silent in spirit. They came from Senegambia, Congo, Dahomey, and the Bight of Benin. They spoke different tongues, but they shared rhythms, memories, and traditions that survived the Atlantic crossing. At night, in the quarters behind their masters' houses, they told stories, played drums, and sang in cadences that mingled grief with defiance. They remembered Africa, and they learned about Haiti. For the Haitian Revolution cast a long shadow. Saint-Domingue lay only a few hundred miles from New Orleans, and news traveled swiftly along the currents of the Gulf. Sailors whispered of plantations burned, of planters fleeing with nothing but the clothes on their backs, of black generals defeating French troops in open battle. Refugees from Saint-Domingue arrived in Louisiana, their eyes haunted, their stories laced with fear. For the enslaved in Louisiana, Haiti was proof: the impossible was possible. For the Spanish rulers, Haiti was a nightmare waiting to repeat itself. The Spanish crown tried to balance repression with pragmatism. Louisiana's officials issued edicts restricting slave gatherings, forbidding drumming and dances that smacked of African ritual. Patrols prowled the streets at night, watching for secret meetings. Yet the city's economy depended on enslaved workers moving freely, carrying water, selling produce, rowing boats. Total control was impossible, and in every alley and tavern the authorities feared conspiracies might be brewing. At the same time, Louisiana's political landscape was turbulent. Though ruled by Spain, much of its population remained French at heart, resentful of Spanish bureaucracy. The ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, circulated in pamphlets and in conversations among Creole elites. Some embraced them, others recoiled in horror. But either way, the atmosphere was combustible. In such a city, the enslaved did not need to invent rebellion from nothing. They breathed it in with every rumor, every scrap of news. And Louisiana was not isolated. Across the Mississippi Valley, enslaved Africans resisted in smaller, quieter ways, refusing work, sabotaging tools, fleeing into the swamps. Maroon communities hid in the bayous, trading with sympathetic free people of color. In Natchez, uprisings had already erupted decades earlier. The memory of resistance lived on, even when suppressed. By 1795, the soil was fertile with rage, and the sparks of Haiti and Paris threatened to ignite it. This was Louisiana at the eve of conspiracy, a port city glittering with wealth but resting uneasily on chains, a colony outwardly loyal to Spain but inwardly divided, a society that imagined itself safe but trembled at every whisper of revolt. And in its streets, enslaved men and women began to imagine something bold, that New Orleans itself, the heart of the colony, could be seized and transformed, not by armies from Europe, but by the very people its rulers called property. It did not begin with a trumpet blast or a banner raised high. The Louisiana Conspiracy of 1795 began in whispers in kitchens, in workshops, in the crowded taverns where dock workers gathered after dusk. It began with fragments of stories drifting across the Gulf, tales of Haiti, of liberty proclaimed in France, of chains breaking in other corners of the Americas. These fragments did not need to be precise to inspire. They carried enough fire to kindle imagination. In New Orleans, the enslaved were not isolated on distant plantations. They walked the streets daily, selling produce, hauling goods, and hearing the city's gossip. Some worked as boatmen, carrying messages up and down the Mississippi. Others were hired out, moving between households and workshops, exchanging news along the way. The result was a network, unplanned, invisible to authorities, but resilient. Information could pass from dock to market to field in the span of a day. The leaders of the conspiracy are difficult to name with certainty, for the Spanish records, written after arrests, filtered everything through the eyes of power. But the outlines are clear enough. Among them were enslaved men who worked on the docks in proximity to sailors and ships that carried whispers of Haiti. There were artisans, skilled workers trusted to move about the city. There were women vendors whose baskets of fruit and fish carried not only food, but messages tucked beneath leaves. Their plan, though bold, was not reckless. They had watched the city carefully. They knew when the guard patrols were thinnest, when the arsenal was least defended, when soldiers were distracted by festivals or church processions. They knew the layout of New Orleans, its narrow streets, its plazas, its weak points. And they understood that their strength lay not in retreat. There were no mountains here, no jungles to flee into, but in striking at the very heart of the colony. The conspiracy called for thousands to rise at once. Enslaved workers from plantations near the city would march in, joining urban laborers. They would seize weapons from the arsenal, torch warehouses, and overwhelm the Spanish garrison. Their ultimate goal was nothing less than the capture of New Orleans itself, the jewel of Louisiana, the lifeline of the Mississippi. From there, perhaps they imagined declaring freedom or holding the port until outside allies arrived. And they had reason to believe allies might come. France, though distant, still loomed in memory. Spanish officials feared that French radicals or Haitian revolutionaries might aid the enslaved in Louisiana. Sailors from Saint-Domingue passed through the port, bringing stories of black generals defeating white armies. The enslaved who heard them did not need precise details. They only needed to know that elsewhere, men and women like themselves had fought and won. Religious brotherhoods played their part as well. Catholic confraternities for Africans, sanctioned by the Church, allowed gatherings that otherwise would have been banned. Within these groups, bonds of trust formed, bonds strong enough to carry plans of rebellion. At night, in the quarters, drums spoke rhythms that masters dismissed as entertainment, but which carried deeper meaning: unity, readiness, resolve. Weapons were scarce, but the enslaved were resourceful. Kitchen knives could become daggers, tools could be repurposed into clubs or spears. A handful of muskets, smuggled or stolen, were guarded like treasures. Capoeira, the African martial art disguised as dance, offered another weapon. In the alleys of New Orleans, young men trained in rhythm and motion, preparing bodies that could strike as swiftly as blades. By the spring of 1795, the plan had taken shape. The timing was deliberate, to coincide with wider unrest. Spanish Louisiana was not only threatened from within, but from without. That same year, free settlers on the Mississippi were agitating for rights, influenced by the French Revolution. Discontent rippled through the region. The conspirators believed the moment was ripe. Yet, secrecy is fragile. The larger the plan grew, the harder it became to hide. And in a world where torture awaited the slightest suspect, betrayal could be bought with fear or favor. The Louisiana Conspiracy was daring, but it was also vulnerable. Even as leaders whispered of liberty, others whispered to officials. Soon, the Spanish authorities would move. Every rebellion needs a map. For the conspirators in Louisiana, that map was the very city they walked through each day. They knew its arteries and blind alleys, its weaknesses and strengths, not as strangers, but as the men and women who kept it alive. New Orleans in 1795 was not yet the sprawling metropolis it would later become. The city clung to a bend of the Mississippi, its streets laid out in a grid of narrow blocks, with the Place d'Armes, today's Jackson Square, at its heart. Around the square stood the cathedral, the governor's residence, and the barracks of Spanish troops. From here, authority radiated outward, reinforced by the arsenal that stocked muskets, powder, and bayonets. If the enslaved could seize this space, they could seize the colony's pulse. The blueprint was audacious. Enslaved field hands from nearby plantations would slip into the city under cover of darkness, blending with urban workers who moved freely through the streets. Once assembled, they would strike at multiple points. The arsenal, the first and most crucial target. Without firearms, the revolt would remain a riot. With them, it could become a war. The barracks. Spanish soldiers, though disciplined, were few in number compared to the enslaved. A sudden attack in the night might overwhelm them before reinforcements could arrive. The marketplace. Seizing the central square would create panic, disrupt trade, and send the message that the city was in rebel hands. The mansions. Fires were to be set in the homes of wealthy planters and merchants, ensuring chaos and fear. Leadership was to be collective, not centralized around a single general. This was both strength and weakness. On one hand, it made the movement harder to decapitate. On the other, it left coordination fragile. Still, the conspirators believed unity of purpose would bind them, freedom or nothing. The influence of Haiti is unmistakable. In Saint-Domingue, the uprising of 1791 had begun with coordinated attacks on plantations, followed by the seizing of arms and the destruction of symbols of colonial power. Louisiana's conspirators sought to adapt that model, shifting it from rural cane fields to the streets of a port city. They understood that their chances of retreat into swamps were slim. Instead, they aimed for a strike so decisive that it would seize control before Spanish reinforcements could react. The French Revolution also echoed in their minds. Liberty, equality, fraternity. These were not just words spoken in Paris salons, they circulated as dangerous ideas, carried in pamphlets, overheard in taverns, murmured in kitchens. Free men of color in New Orleans, many of them literate and politically aware, provided another layer of inspiration. Some of them had ties to revolutionary France, others to refugees from Haiti. While their level of involvement in the conspiracy remains debated, their presence in the city created a bridge between worlds. Timing was crucial. The uprising was reportedly planned to coincide with festivals or distractions, moments when soldiers' vigilance would wane. There is evidence that the rebels considered striking during Corpus Christi, when processions filled the streets and the city's attention was elsewhere. At such a moment, torches and blades could turn devotion into chaos. Weapons were scarce, but imagination filled the gap. Kitchen knives sharpened to deadly points, axes and hoes repurposed as war tools, sticks and stones stockpiled in hidden corners. A few muskets stolen or smuggled promised to even the odds if the arsenal could be captured. And capoeira fighters, their bodies trained in a rhythm of motion, prepared to turn alleys into battlefields. Above all, the plan rested on numbers. New Orleans was a city where the enslaved often outnumbered free whites in the streets. If thousands rose at once, the Spanish garrison, perhaps a few hundred strong, could be overwhelmed. The conspirators envisioned a tidal wave, a rising so sudden and so broad that the city would collapse before the crown could strike back. But revolutions are not only about tactics, they are about belief. And in 1795, belief was in the air. The conspirators believed in Haiti's victory. They believed in France's Declaration of Liberty. They believed that their own chains were not eternal, and they believed that one night of courage could remake their world. It was a dangerous dream, and like all dangerous dreams, it drew the eyes of those who wished to stop it. No conspiracy, however carefully guarded, can remain invisible forever. And in 1795, Louisiana, the eyes of authority were everywhere. Spanish officials lived in constant dread of another Haiti. They knew the enslaved outnumbered their masters. They knew the city could turn against them in a single night. Suspicion made them listen closely, and fear made them act quickly. The Louisiana Conspiracy unraveled not because the conspirators lost courage, but because someone spoke. History does not tell us precisely who. Some records suggest that an enslaved man, fearful of torture or enticed by promises of leniency, revealed the plot. Others hint that free people of color, caught between loyalty and survival, passed information to officials. Perhaps it was a slip of the tongue in a tavern, a whispered plan overheard by the wrong ears. However it happened, the fragile veil of secrecy was pierced. Spanish authorities moved swiftly. In June of 1795, arrests began. Patrols swept through the city at night, dragging men from their quarters, seizing women suspected of carrying messages. Shackled groups were marched to the barracks, where interrogations awaited. The Governor's Council convened emergency sessions, determined to root out every hint of rebellion before it could ignite. The interrogations were brutal. Torture was a standard instrument of justice in the colonies, and Spanish officials used it without hesitation. Prisoners were tied, beaten, and pressed for names. Under the agony of whips and chains, confessions spilled out, sometimes truth, often invention. Fear and pain broke bonds of trust, spreading the net wider and wider. One name led to another. Soon, dozens were implicated. The more the conspirators spoke under duress, the larger the conspiracy appeared. Officials became convinced that thousands were prepared to rise, that the entire city was at risk of burning. Panic swept through the colonial elite. Merchants barred their windows. Soldiers doubled their patrols. Priests urged calm in sermons, but their trembling voices betrayed their own fear. Trials followed, though they were little more than theater. The accused stood before magistrates who had already decided their fate. Charges of sedition, plotting rebellion, and inciting insurrection carried only one possible penalty. Some prisoners tried to deny their involvement. Others admitted guilt, either defiantly or resignedly. None of it mattered. The Spanish Crown's law was clear. To conspire was to die. Executions were staged as public warnings. In the Place d'Armes, gallows rose. The condemned, mostly enslaved Africans, but also some free men of color suspected of aiding them, were paraded before the crowd. Chains clanked, drums beat, soldiers lined the square, and one by one, bodies swung in the humid air of New Orleans. The message was unmistakable. This is the price of rebellion. Yet, if the Spanish hoped that these spectacles would restore security, they deceived themselves. For every body on the gallows, a dozen more enslaved men and women carried the memory of their courage. For every confession wrung under torture, others carried silent resentment deeper into their hearts. Fear did not erase the dream of freedom, it sharpened it. The betrayal and arrests of 1795 crushed the immediate conspiracy, but they also confirmed the colonists' worst nightmare. There had been a plan, there had been leaders, there had been thousands ready to rise. The city had been only a whisper away from fire, and that fear would never leave New Orleans. For the Spanish officials and Louisiana's planter elite, the arrests of 1795 did not bring peace. If anything, they deepened a gnawing paranoia, because beneath every execution, beneath every confession extracted by whip and rack, one truth loomed. The enslaved population had planned to strike. The colony had stared into the abyss, and what it saw was Haiti. Only 4 years earlier, in 1791, enslaved Africans in Saint-Domingue had risen in fury, torching sugar plantations and cutting down their masters. That uprising had grown into a revolution that toppled France's hold on the colony, defeated Napoleon's armies, and was already reshaping the Atlantic world. Refugees from Saint-Domingue crowded into Louisiana, carrying stories of flames, blood, and freedom. Their tales haunted the ruling class of New Orleans. To them, the Louisiana Conspiracy was proof that Haiti's fire could leap the sea. Even before the plot was betrayed, Spanish officials had worried about the contagion of revolutionary ideas. French radicals and sailors, Haitian revolutionaries, even free people of color with ties to the Caribbean, all were viewed as possible sparks. The conspiracy confirmed their darkest suspicions. The fear reshaped policy. Patrols grew harsher. Laws multiplied to restrict movement, assembly, and expression. Enslaved workers were banned from carrying drums, from gathering after dark, from speaking languages their masters could not understand. Catholic brotherhoods, once tolerated as spiritual outlets, came under stricter watch. Even free people of color, who lived in a fragile middle ground between bondage and liberty, found their rights curtailed. Newspapers fanned the anxiety, publishing proclamations that warned of plots and poisons hidden among the enslaved. Priests urged obedience, portraying revolt as both a sin and a danger to the soul. Officials wrote frantically to Madrid, begging for reinforcements and funds to strengthen their grip. The conspiracy, though suppressed, became a permanent ghost in their imagination. But fear is a double-edged sword. In their terror, Louisiana's rulers revealed their weakness. They knew that their wealth, their status, even their very lives rested on the obedience of those who outnumbered them. They lived behind walls, guarded by soldiers, yet never felt secure. Their authority, so carefully staged in plazas and proclamations, trembled in the face of whispers from kitchens and alleys. For the enslaved, the fear of their masters was a kind of victory. Even in defeat, even with gallows rising in the city square, they had proven a truth, that the powerful were not invulnerable. A rumor could unsettle them. A plan, even betrayed, could shake them. The dream of Haiti was alive in Louisiana, and the elite could not unsee it. The conspiracy of 1795 had ended in chains, but it left behind an atmosphere that would shape the next decades. Harsher laws, tighter surveillance, and an unspoken knowledge that rebellion was always possible. The masters feared it, the enslaved remembered it. And in 1811, on the German coast upriver from New Orleans, that memory would erupt again in one of the largest slave uprisings in North American history. The shadow of Haiti stretched across the Mississippi, and Louisiana lived in fear that the fire would return. The Louisiana Conspiracy of 1795 was short-lived, crushed before it could erupt into open flames. On the surface, it seemed a failure, leaders arrested, plans exposed, bodies swinging from the gallows. But the true legacy of the conspiracy lies not in its immediate outcome, but in the shadows it cast over Louisiana's history and in the way it has been remembered or forgotten. For the enslaved themselves, memory was survival. The events of 1795 did not disappear. They lived on in whispers, in songs, in the rhythms of drums beaten in secret. Children heard of fathers who had planned to rise, of mothers who risked their lives to pass hidden messages, of neighbors who endured torture without betraying others. These memories circulated quietly, outside the reach of Spanish officials, passed from generation to generation as proof that resistance was not only possible but necessary. For the ruling class, the memory was fear. Even years later, governors and planners still spoke of the 1795 conspiracy as a warning. They tightened restrictions, justified new laws, and reminded one another that vigilance was the only safeguard against destruction. The ghost of the conspiracy lingered in their minds whenever they walked through the marketplace or passed an enslaved worker on the levee. And history did not stop in 1795. The conspiracy became part of a pattern that stretched across Louisiana and beyond. In 1811, upriver from New Orleans, enslaved men and women launched the German Coast Uprising, the largest slave revolt in U.S. history. They marched toward New Orleans with drums beating, their numbers swelling, echoing the very fears born in 1795. Though also suppressed, it showed that the dream of freedom could not be extinguished. Yet, despite its significance, the Louisiana Conspiracy rarely appears in textbooks or public memory. Unlike Haiti's Revolution, which reshaped the world, or Nat Turner's Rebellion, which rattled the United States, the 1795 plot remains obscure. Partly this is because it was stopped before it erupted fully, leaving few dramatic battles to record. Partly it is because the records we have come from Spanish officials who minimized the agency of the enslaved and portrayed them as criminals rather than freedom fighters. But silence does not mean insignificance. The conspiracy matters because it reveals the fragile balance of colonial power. It shows that even in the heart of New Orleans, enslaved people were not passive. They were thinking, planning, connecting their struggles to global revolutions. It shows that slavery's foundations were never secure, even in cities, even under vigilant rulers. The memory of 1795 also forces us to confront how history is written, whose voices are preserved and whose are erased. The voices of the conspirators are lost to us, filtered only through confessions torn by pain. But their actions speak across the centuries. They dared to dream of seizing the capital of Louisiana, to burn away the chains of empire. In the silence of archives, we can still hear them if we choose to listen. The Louisiana Conspiracy was not just a failed revolt. It was a fragment of a larger struggle, a note in the long rhythm of resistance that spanned the Americas. Its legacy is a reminder that freedom was never granted. It was fought for, again and again, even when the world conspired to erase the memory. History is often told through monuments of kings, governors, and generals. But the Louisiana Conspiracy of 1795 reminds us that history also lives in whispers, in the kitchens of enslaved workers, in the hidden corners of taverns, in the hearts of men and women who dared to imagine the impossible. They did not succeed in seizing New Orleans. Their uprising was betrayed before it could ignite. But the courage of their vision still matters. It tells us that enslaved people were not passive shadows in someone else's story. They were actors, planners, and rebels who forced empires to tremble. Their lives carried the same fire that burned in Haiti, in Jamaica, in Bahia. Proof that resistance was everywhere, even in the streets of Louisiana's capital. For too long, this story has been buried, written off as a failed plot, forgotten outside of archives. But silence is not absence. Every whisper of rebellion, even suppressed, shaped the world we inherited. Every act of defiance carved cracks into the chains that bound millions, and those cracks in time shattered. If this story moved you, if it made you see Louisiana not only as a land of plantations and ports, but as a place where enslaved men and women dreamed of freedom, then help keep their memory alive. Subscribe so you won't miss the next hidden chapter of slavery's dark past. Share this video so others can learn how deeply resistance shaped history. Leave a comment with your reflections, because dialogue keeps memory alive. The past still speaks. Together we can make sure it is heard.